Hey folks, Casual Dad here again for our second Warlord guide in Warhammer Combat Cards. Today we're going to be talking about the boogeyman himself, Kaptin Badrukk. Now for me, I consider Kaptin Badrukk to be one of the most meta or game-defining warlords out there. He's kind of in the top three, in large part because he has a very strong theme, and most of the decks you run into with him have the same kind of build. He's also very, very popular, so you will run into him a lot at pretty much every tier. In the upper tiers of Terra, at like the high competitive end, you'll run into some incredibly scary, usually near max Badrukk decks that can really give you a lot of trouble. But pretty much anywhere you'll run into him, and as you're starting out, he can be very challenging to beat. And then also even later on, he's one lucky hit away from kind of completely turning a game around. So we're going to talk about his ability, a couple builds, I'm going to play a few games with him, and we're going to kind of talk about where his strengths are and how you can go about beating him. First of all, let's look at his ability. And mine's not super high level, and I've got a couple levels in the wings that I may do during this video. But long story short, he's got decent stats, pretty low cost. He's got both melee and ranged, but his real secret sauce is his special ability. So whenever one of your orc cards destroys an enemy card with a ranged attack, that orc card attacks for 60% of its ranged attack. So he gets multiple shots. A couple things to note here, that is not necessarily on his turn. It's not necessarily even in the attack step, and there's no limit to it. So if you drop a card that has a lot of damage on the drop, it can fire, trigger its bonus shot, fire again, trigger its bonus shot. So it's not unusual, and he himself has that attack on drop. So if he drops against a weakened card, this Warlord by himself can trigger a board wipe. And then a couple other things. He is legendary and just got the bonus trait of Ready, or Scout, excuse me. So he will get a ranged bonus applied to his entire board when he drops as well, which is a particularly powerful combination to go with him since he already had the ideal ability for his... the ideal trait for his ability in that precision shot. Now, in terms of decks, there are a couple other things that make Badrukk so very strong. For starters, orcs have a lot of really, really good shooting cards, and these ones here are some of the kind of key ones. And I'm going to lean on some cards that you'll see as sort of quote-unquote standard Badrukk bits. If you run into a Badrukk deck, there's a good chance it has these cards exactly, or some combination of these, and pretty much always has at least 3 of the 5 of these in the deck. A couple things about it, these are very expensive cards, so it's going to be a small deck, but they are all high hit point cards aside from Smirk here. And so they do take quite a bit to bring down, especially since they're putting out so much range damage, and one of them has shields and another has taunt. So just to run through it, kind of the signature card of the deck is going to be this guy right here, the Squig Buggy. It's got that barrage trait, and so remembering from Badrukk's trait, any ranged attack will do it. Doesn't have to be on the primary target. So if this guy shoots, primary target tanks it, but something to either side of that primary target takes lethal damage, he will still get to shoot again, and then can trigger additional bonus attacks. So he's extremely powerful and can throw out a lot of damage and a lot of damage to adjacent targets. So this is a very, very scary card with that high cost, with that very high hit point value. Next up is some combination of these two. You don't always see these, but they're very common. It is a smaller deck, and even with the high hit points, it can be burned down. So you'll see a lot of Badrukk players drop in this guy, because he combos well with Badrukk's ability, fits well in the deck, and has shields, so he can tank some extra hits. And this is one that you have to decide right at the outset of the game if you're going to try to take this thing down, or ignore it and try to take down the other cards, and hope to take it down later, maybe. Still has a very high ranged attack, has a melee attack, so it can also ping down shields and weaken cards even if you hit in melee, and is also very fast. It's got a high initiative. Next up is one that's somewhat less common, but still comes up a lot, is going to be this little monster of mini tanks. Very high hit points, low cost, and has taunt. Also has a not insignificant ranged attack itself, so that's why it comes in these decks a lot. But mostly it's taken for that taunt and the high hit points, so you get 2 turns where you can just lay into the enemy deck as Badrukk without worrying as much about attacks back. Very frustrating card. It's one that wasn't seen in Badrukk decks early on, but I've been seeing it more and more, especially in the past couple seasons. Also legendary, so in addition to that taunt, it also gained that Scout for that Ready, so it, when it deploys, will also give the entire deck a ranged attack bonus as well. And then, of course, last but not least, Skardaka. Now, if you ever see a Badrukk, the number one thing you need to keep in mind is that this card is almost certainly coming. The AI almost always plays it late, so it's going to be one of your later cards. It's probably going to land on a board where your cards are already weakened. So when it drops with that precision shot on that crazy high attack damage, and this isn't even anywhere near max. At max, it does this. It does a full 147 on landing, which can then trigger those bonus attacks. You need to plan for this landing on the board. Number one counter to Badrukk, you want a shield or really heavy fear card or something with a ton of hit points that you can kind of keep in the wings to drop to tank this hit, so this doesn't trigger a board wipe. Or, if your deck is robust enough and you have enough cards left, you can just assume that when this drops, you're going to have your board wiped and make up for it in following turns. So this is probably the single scariest piece of the whole deck, but in some combinations, the other cards will win the game without them. Just to look at some other combinations you see, I do see pretty much all of the ranged attackers in here. One thing I considered doing was replacing this shielded guy here with this one for myself. It's got close to the same ranged attack, less hit points, but mine is shielded 3, whereas this guy still needs a couple levels, so he's only, well, he's shielded 3, I did that, okay. So, but that's why I considered making the change. Hit points are similar, cost is lower, so I could fit in something bigger than Smirk It if I did that change. But I wanted to go ahead and show the kind of more standard build, because you don't see this guy anywhere near as much. Some other builds you, of course, will probably see. You do sometimes see this guy here, just because he does have a decent ranged attack, but can also balance out with that heavy melee, has the high hit points, is still very, very fast, and is still cheaper than some of the other cards, but is on the more expensive side. You may also see these cards as well. This guy has that outflank to get the bonus, still has the same other benefits of being very fast with a high ranged attack, still has a melee attack, bunch of hit points. Or this one. You will sometimes see this one instead of Skardaka. It's a lot less common. I imagine it's usually a case where the player doesn't have as high a level of this card as they do of the yellow guy. But this is really the defining card of the deck, like the number one that you're going to see the most often. Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's play some games. And so we already talked about Badrukk's ability, we already talked about the bodyguards, but just to kind of recap those full advantages, every time you play as Badrukk, or ooh, a mirror match, oh, so good. Yeah. Alright, so we'll see how this goes. Anytime you play as Badrukk, there's a really strong chance that you will go first. If you play against a Badrukk, there's a very strong chance that he will go first. So we're going to see a slightly different Badrukk build. We talked a little bit about the advantage of Barrage with the Squig Buggy, in that it does give you the chance to trigger Badrukk's bonus attack against something other than the primary target. That's also quite a bit cheaper, so you will see some players put that in place of the more expensive cards because it still hits very hard, but not maybe as hard. And now I'm going to trigger the bonus attack because I hit that card to the left with my Barrage, and then this is going to trigger an additional bonus attack. And then, yeah, which is just, so that amount of fire that I just laid in was just crazy. So I stripped all 3 shields off this thing in a single round of shooting. He dropped his Skardaka, my taunt is still up. And so that is also something I wanted to illustrate, so this is perfect, is just that the reason I consider Badrukk to be so meta-defining is he's extremely powerful, and watch this drop, this is going to be great, and because if you run endless cards in your deck, it's a huge liability, because if you see that Badrukk, he's probably going to wipe your board, because if the Swig Buggy shoots an endless card, it gets to trigger those barrage attacks multiple times. So if that endless card has less than 76 hit points remaining, this guy shoots it, he could kill it, and then do the barrage attack to either side, and then kill the copy that comes back, and then again trigger those barrage attacks, and then shoot an additional time. So if you have a deck that has a lot of squishy cards, Badrukk is just going to eat it alive, and probably wipe it, not necessarily multiple times, but like dramatically do it. So that was a particularly favorable mirror match. That drop of Smirk It right across from my Barrage card was huge. That let me just wipe those shields and put just a ton of damage down. In terms of card level, we actually were about on par here, but because it was Badrukk versus Badrukk, you could kind of see that the two match up against each other well. So that's the thing. As a human playing against AI, if you have Badrukk versus Badrukk, unless they're significantly higher level than you probably will beat it. I'm going to play probably 2 more games just to kind of see here. I do expect to lose, but we'll see. In part because my Badrukk isn't that high level, and in part because he does have counters. Let's see if we can find something really scary. So to talk about some counters. So we've talked about this a little bit. Number one piece is you need to be able to take a hit. And I would honestly not include endless cards in your deck, which really, that's the reason I have sort of a unhappy relationship with Badrukk, is you want to include endless cards in a lot of deck builds. They really help flesh out the kind of durability of your deck, and they make a big difference in what you can do, but there's such a liability if Badrukk is a likely matchup. And it sucks to have to say that, but that's the big thing, is remember that any endless card you put in, any low hit point card you put in, is probably going to be a liability as you're laddering, because you're likely to hit Badrukk. I mentioned this a little bit before, but all of Badrukk's cards are very fast, so there's a very high chance that you will be shooting first. And now this is a great matchup to show too, because Kaptin Badrukk, we've talked about him before, is one of the decent counters to Badrukk, because anytime a card dies, it doesn't die. So he has a lot of ways to avoid triggering Badrukk's follow-up shot. But, watch this. First card is going to trigger that 5 health. Second card is going to do it again. My bonus shots will then kill both of the other cards. So you can still beat it. So Badrukk is not a flat counter. He is one of the stronger pieces against Badrukk, especially a particularly high-level or scary Badrukk, which this one isn't. But yeah. So that is one of the things to look out for. So cards that can somehow not die, like Badrukk's ability, very powerful against Badrukk. Cards that can take a really big hit, very strong against Badrukk. Cards that can dish out a lot of damage very quickly, especially if it's ranged, to counter shoot against Badrukk, or also if it is. And so here, right here, you're actually going to see this trigger. So I'm going to drop this guy. Normally this would be a board wipe, but because this is Badrukk, it is not. So that right there is very strong. As long as you have a card that still has some hit points left, it can stand up to that counter shot. Now this is probably going to be a board wipe though, because I'll get that kill, trigger the second shot, which will then trigger that shot. Oh, it's not quite a wipe. Oh, yes it is. That's the thing about Badrukk. Well, okay, not quite, but very close. I always underestimate the number of bonus shots they're gonna show up, even when I'm playing as Badrukk, even when I'm very aware of it. And it just seems insane to me that there's no limit to those, that you can fire as many bonus shots as you can trigger. Which is one of the things that makes Badrukk seem a little bit outside the power curve. So he has no way he can't attack. That's his only move he could do without dying. Now, this wasn't the best example because that's a relatively low-level Badrukk. Its trophy level is, 500 under mine. And the cards weren't that high level. It also didn't have kind of the standard Tigurius in it, who's a 3-shielded monstrosity that would be psychicking back without taking any kills there. So your sort of standard Badrukk, and we're going to talk about that in a later video, is a very strong counter to Badrukk, and one of the things that keeps Badrukk in line. Other things that are really good against Badrukk are going to be Zephyrblade. And I'm kind of hung up here. We'll see if this lets me go to the next screen. Zephyrбlade's very good because you can lose some cards. You can save your powerful cards for late game. So you can just take a board wipe, even 2 board wipes, and then drop something really terrifying to just wipe that Badrukk right back. Because if you start taking out these power cards quickly, he doesn't really recover from that. It looks like we may have a hang-up here. Another thing Badrukk doesn't like is anything that debuffs his cards. So something like Gloguthrux, the Chaos Warlord, who whenever one of your cards is killed, does a debuff to the enemy deck, or the card that made that kill. A timing note here, that triggers after Badrukk's bonus shots. So as Badrukk is shooting, he could get multiple kills before getting that debuff triggered by Gloguthrux. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And that's true of a lot of things. So even the Eldari Warlords that get a bonus from when a friendly card, any card dies, or the Magus, the Servants of the Emperor Warlord, who, and we'll play one more, who gives his friendly cards a plus 20% HP, or plus 20 HP when one of them dies. Ooh, there's another great one. Yeah, so I'm going to play to finish that thought. So when Badrukk is doing his bonus attacks, don't expect to get the benefit of your abilities first. So Skardaka could drop into a board wipe before any bonus hit points are applied. And that also feels like he has a bit of an outside power curve for me. just because he can do that. So it should be Skardaka shoots, kills a card, gets the debuff from Gloggothrox, or the HP bonus goes across the board for whoever else is on there. Say, like the Magus example. He should get those bonus hit points before Badrukk's bonus attacks go, but he doesn't. So that's the thing to remember, is that Badrukk always goes first. Both moving, deploying, shooting, getting kills, he will apply his abilities first. And that may be initiative-based. I haven't really checked to tell, because Badrukk always goes first. But that is something to watch out for. So don't count on getting your defensive buffs before a board wipe happens. This is a really good deck I wanted to show, because Artemis's ability is the one where anytime he deploys a card, there's a 20% hit to an enemy card at random. And since all of Badrukk's cards are very high hit points, that is extremely powerful. Here we can see that barrage trigger. I'm just going to do another attack on that. And then that did a bonus attack because I killed 2 cards in his first shot. So that was one more attack than I would normally expect, and that's one of the ones that can catch me off guard. Still not in a particularly powerful position, because Artemis has a big deck here. No jokes on that one. And he still has a lot of cards. And they're all decently high hit points, and that one has Big Game Hunter. So this is the first game where I've really felt a little bit under threat. I think I've still got it, because again, these aren't terribly high level. It's still early in the season, so most of the games you get matched up with, if you're higher ranked, are not going to be at the same rank. And that's kind of a general matchmaking note, is early in the season, because so many decks are in the same points pools, where there are so many more cards like right at 2k, most of those will never get above 2k, and so they kind of mix in with the ones that will, the really scary powerful decks. So what you actually end up facing is a lot more likely to be a favorable matchup for you. And I've talked about that a bit. This is going to be another wipe. And I've still got Skardaka in the wings, and I will have a shot on Artemis himself. Here we go. Look at all those army bonus attacks. And the last card didn't even shoot that time, because the Squig Buggy gets so many bonus shots. Woof. So typical AI play. He played to the left there, and so I will keep my last card alive, which is really going to hurt him here. And so I have this in the bag. But generally speaking, if they're roughly leveled, if they're roughly approximately leveled, a fine-tuned Artemis deck will really give a Badrukk deck some trouble. Throw some shields in there, throw in a little bit more, or some higher level traits. And yeah, it's a very different matchup. But of course, in this case, I'm leveled higher, I'm rated higher. It isn't AI, so it didn't make some of the best plays. That, again, wasn't the best example of an Artemis deck, but an upper-level Artemis deck will really, really give Badrukk some trouble. So if you're looking at what to play, Space Marines have some very strong answers to Badrukk in both of those. And even the others, I talked before about the most improved deck of this season because of those secondary traits, is going to be Helbrecht. This guy right here. Just because he can get so overwhelmingly powerful that he can start bending back those Badrukk cards really quickly. He doesn't get as much of a bonus against Badrukk because Badrukk has fewer cards to kill and they take a while to bring down. But Helbrecht decks can just get completely out of hand with the sheer volume of melee damage they can put out. Just because they have a stacking buff every time one gets a kill in melee. If he's got a couple big game hunters and hard-hitting cards and some target acquired to focus fire on a single one of your cards, that can actually take down Badrukk too. So just to recap, we're talking about some of the biggest counters to Badrukk. Zephyrblade is one that comes up. Tolmaron is one that comes up because a relatively sizable deck and has some ranged cards that will hit back harder and not die, and usually includes some form of big game hunter as well. Artemis, just because of his default ability, hitting really hard on Badrukk's few high hit point cards. Less so Darkstrider, just because Darkstrider himself, the Warlord, is quite squishy. So he's good, but just because Tau in general are good at shooting, but Darkstrider is one of the weaker ones. He can do well if you have a couple really, really hard-hitting cards and then some taunt cards, so you can use his ability to move cards around and get those free shots to soften up Badrukk's cards. That can work. I mentioned Gloggothrox. He's not a bad combo, but you will tend to bleed cards against Badrukk because, again, that damage debuff is applied after your cards die. So he can still get some aggressive board wipes against you, and Gloggothrox himself is middling. You usually have a couple power cards in that and a lot of fear and poison, so Gloggothrox is still a good match against Badrukk, but it's not necessarily a hard counter. Both Magus and Rakarth struggle for exactly the reasons I mentioned before, because their hit point buff is applied after your cards are killed. So Badrukk will get the multiple kills before your defensive buffs are applied. Of the two, Rakarth is a little better, because his ability will trigger on the cards in your deck, which Badrukk can't kill before they're played, so that's a nice bonus there. Magus can really struggle. Manifest Nightmare, if you have a melee deck, can be good against Badrukk because it has that flat defensive buff, defensive buff or bonus against attacks of a type that the card doesn't have. So a melee card with a melee card in a Manifest Nightmare deck that doesn't have a ranged attack will get a flat, close to half damage from every shot, which is very, very powerful. And that one can be very good, especially if you have some thick, hard-hitting melee cards, especially if you have some with Fear. That stacks to really tank some damage from Badrukk, and Badrukk can struggle to get through those. Not the case for Creed. Creed's generally very powerful, has some very powerful cards, but he can struggle against Badrukk because his cards only come back into his hand after a friendly card dies, and so Badrukk can poach some bonus kills off of him before his ability triggers. These two, Zeemut and Illic, they both have Snipe. They have a lot of hard-hitting ranged bonus. They usually have very, very powerful and durable ranged-hitting cards. Both of those are pretty strong counters to Badrukk because they can shoot back almost as hard, if not harder, and they both also have the target acquired, where if the Warlord drops, if Badrukk is already on the table when one of those Warlords drops, all of the cards in their board will hit Badrukk himself, which helps make up for that extra hit points and can really take him down. Because Badrukk decks are smaller, Headhunter decks tend to be pretty strong against him. Likewise, Snickrot has a lot of tough, durable cards that can shoot back just as hard usually. Zagstruck does okay because it's a heavy melee deck and gets free attacks, so it can continue to do melee and free attacks on the drop without getting counterattacks from Badrukk. It's a little glassy, so that can be risky. Lilith does okay because her cards rely on getting kills. You can hit a bit of a wall of Badrukk where it takes too long to chew down individual cards. If you have some high-powered, like the Crimson Hunter, like a really high-level Crimson Hunter, you may lose it, but if it takes another card down with it, that can be a way to crack through a Badrukk deck and do pretty well. Someone like Shadow Sun is very, very powerful because she's durable herself, her cards shoot a lot, and she gets that heal when she drops. So if you deploy correctly, she can be pretty strong. Ahriman has the Psychic, but tends to rely on a few very expensive cards, so it's pretty risky. You can pull it off, but you need to burn down those Orc cards real fast. We already talked about Akaran. What's his face? Gosar. Gosar's okay. Gosar and the Parasite both struggle with the same thing, where they usually have a fair number of ablative, endless, or kind of squishy cards that Badrukk can take advantage of to quickly clean up your deck. They also take a little time to get rolling, so Badrukk kind of eats them alive. We talked about Helbrecht. Skulltaker's pretty good because you usually have some tough, hard-hitting melee cards. And again, melee not ranged, so they can do some damage. In my Skulltaker decks, I have a lot of poison and shields, which really helps kind of tank the hits from Badrukk, which is because I built the deck to make sure I could withstand those Badrukk matches, which normally would be a challenge. Any deck that relies on getting kills to beef itself up, so Huron here, can really struggle against Badrukk. If you have a lot of really high-power Fear cards, they can do very well in a Huron deck against Badrukk, but that's a challenging matchup. Rely, all of the Tau Warlords benefit from having such powerful ranged attacks that they can hit with, and Shazo is particularly good because he has both the offensive buffs and the defensive buffs every 3 turns, and then also himself has shields and hits very hard. So being a shielded Warlord himself can help push you over the edge against Badrukk. Greyfax does well. She's usually got a small deck as well, so in terms of cards for cards, you got to make sure you trade well. If you have a hard-hitting, if you have a tough enough deck that either has high ranged or has a lot of psychic back, she can do well, especially because Greyfax herself now has that big game hunter that can help wipe out a lingering big card if there's one still there and let you pull Badrukk. But that's not the best matchup for either of them. Badrukk doesn't like decks where he can't get easy kills. Greyfax doesn't like decks that have that much beef to hit back. So that's actually a bit of a toss-up. Pretty much all of these others, Badrukk is going to have the advantage even Mozrog because there's so much durability and so much range fire going back. Badrukk is very bursty and can take down Mozrog's deck before Mozrog has a chance to get rolling. A pretty solid matchups here. You're going to see Santa, Logan, is pretty good, usually because you have some very durable decks, or very durable cards in there that hit really hard, and because of his overflow, if the Badrukk deck has that taunt card, that's actually an advantage, because you can burn it down quickly, and if it ends up at low hit points and you hit it really hard, it's going to do a lot of damage to an adjacent card. It could be through shields, could really, really help bring these down, and Logan himself is so tough and hits so hard that his endgame is very strong against Badrukk too, so he's not a bad one. My dear favorite Tervagon struggles really hard. I've got a very high level one and a high level deck, so I do pretty well against Badrukk with her. But that's a tricky matchup because she leans really heavily on that free card. She gets that free Termagant, who is just absolute fuel for Badrukk's ability. So you need to have beefy cards in the deck that can tank some hits from Badrukk and avoid leaning on her strongest ability. So that's a tough matchup, but you can win it with some careful play and some beefy ranged cards. So there's the shield card, and then her the drop pod, the regen drop pod, has a lot of hit points and takes a while for Badrukk to chew through. Those two cards can help you build a board that can stand up to Badrukk while you work it down. And then if you get a free lane with the Squig Buggy off the table, then you can start using that Tervagon to get some bonus damage. Or Termagant, excuse me, the little free card. These others, all of these guys are really, really expensive, so end up with small decks. In a particularly powerful one, if you have a bunch of shield and fear, they can burn down Badrukk, but the smaller the deck, the better. If you fill these decks with cheap cards just to make sure you have more cards on the table for the more expensive Warlords, they're really going to struggle against Badrukk, because he'll get the bonus shots from those squishy cards, and then can do things like that multi-hit barrage and really clear them quickly. These Warlords stack up pretty well against Badrukk, but if you haven't pulled Badrukk himself, he can really burn them down very quickly. So, hopefully that was helpful. If you're around the 2K mark, like your decks are around 2,000 trophies, or your factions are around 2,000 trophies, you're probably going to hit a lot of Badrukk, and it's going to be very frustrating. So I wish you luck. Please do reach out with any questions at all if you need any help getting through kind of these walls. Drop me a question. I can help talk about your specific collection and give you some advice on how to progress in your specific situation. There's also always the option of just assuming you'll lose to Badrukk and not even worrying about it, because he's not going to be more than something like 1 in 5 of your matchups, which is still a lot, but it's not enough to kind of stop you completely. It'll just slow your progression. So, again, hope that's helpful. The next one I'm going to cover is going to be the other boogeyman, Akaran himself, and then we will get back to it. If you do have a vote for which Warlord or Bodyguards you want to see covered next, sing out, drop a comment in my channel, and I'll hit that one next. Appreciate it, and have a good one.